And I think there's always that misunderstanding because people don't really know the difference between type 1 and type 2.
Yeah.
You know? So, like, that's the thing. That's the one they say is like, oh, is this the one if I give this one, it's going to kill you? You know what I mean? So, do you ever run into that? Or have most of the people in your life now know?
Yeah, so my mum also has type 1 diabetes. So my family are very, very aware of kind of what the management of type 1 diabetes are. And most of my friends obviously know I've got diabetes. They know how it's managed. Yeah. Every now and again, you kind of run into someone who kind of mixes up type 1 and type 2 diabetes. But, you know, like people ask questions because they're curious and they're concerned. They don't ask it out of any badness.
Yeah.
Or they don't make comments like, oh, you can't have this out of any malice. They just, they don't know.
I would think that of, like, I only had this conversation with somebody the other day about a completely unrelated topic, but I was saying that, like, I think most people in the things they say that some people may find like slightly offensive or slightly triggering or whatever, they probably didn't mean it with any malice. It might just be how people pick it up. And I suppose that's like a level of maturity because you said you were diagnosed in 2017.
Yes, yeah.
So, you know, you've been living with it now a good while. So you probably realize that, like, a lot of people just, and I'd imagine that's a big thing because I know you said you do your day in the life of during Diabetes Awareness Month. I'd imagine there's a huge amount of like people that are just so ignorant to it. They just don't know.
Yeah. And it's always an opportunity to educate people because like type 1 diabetes is actually pretty common in the population.
You said 15,000?
I think it's 15,000. So like, eventually someone is going to come across someone else with type 1 diabetes. And if something I've said about how I manage my diabetes might make someone go, oh, this person I just met also has type 1 diabetes. And even if they are able to, you know, understand that person a little bit better because of something I said, I just think that's the most amazing thing. Yeah,
I think it's like most things, education is the most important thing because at least if you're arming people with more info, like in anything, whether or not they choose to act on it immediately or it's something they kind of like, and they like store that and then something relevant comes up eventually, it might become that thing. I heard Dawn Steacy say this on a podcast like 3 months ago and now that makes sense, you know, like somebody with type 1, or like even like the insulin pump, you know, it's not an iPod she's carrying around. It's actually something that makes it so she doesn't have to fucking inject herself. What was it, 6 or 7 times a day?
Yeah.
That was one thing that I think was very, very, don't mind, that's just like a little timer for me. That was one thing I was very interested about because there's another guy in abs that only joined recently and I can't remember what his fucking name is, but he's diabetic as well. And I remember that was the first time I'd ever seen the pump and I was straight up like, is that for listening to music? Like, I didn't ask him, I was just looking and then it was actually Claire that said it to me. She's like, no, it's a diabetes pump. It's fucking crazy. Like, was that was fairly revolutionary for you when you got it? Yeah,
absolutely. I love it when people come up to me and ask me, is it an old iPod or a Walkman? I love it.
Yeah,
it makes me laugh. I think Jake Brennan came up to me at Nationals to joke about how my pump looks like an iPod.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah.
I'm surprised he knew what it was. To be honest, like, I mean, he's a shocking man. What he knows about and what he doesn't know about is bizarre. He's a funny guy. Jake's a funny character. Like, I love that, like, the people that have never met Jake, they only know his online persona and they all think he's a big prick, right? But, like, you meet him in person and he's grand. Like, don't get me wrong, he is a big prick. But, like, he's not the worst person in the world. He's just Jake.
Yeah.
You know?
Any interactions I've had with him have, like, always been, like, I've always been very impressed by him.
Yeah.
Like, I've listened to a few podcasts he's recorded over a few years. And like, you know, he speaks very well for himself and I've always enjoyed following his journey. But going back to the insulin pump, it's been revolutionary.
Yeah.
So the insulin pump delivers insulin subcutaneously. So I don't have to whip out an insulin pen and inject myself. If I go out for lunch or dinner, I don't have to worry about, okay, how am I going to inject myself under a dress or, a tight top or whatever. But even outside of that, the insulin pump links in with a sensor, which monitors my blood glucose. My current insulin pump auto-regulates my my insulin delivery in response to that. So I've gone from even thinking about my diabetes every 10, 15 minutes to I found myself in work the other day. I didn't even think about my diabetes for 4 hours straight because I knew my insulin pump was doing what it needed to do in the background and keeping me safe and healthy.
Yeah.
Which is, it's such a game changer.
Am I right in saying I've seen on your story a couple of times you've posted it's almost like a little stats screen.
Yeah.
I assume it links to an app on your phone or something.
It does, but it won't work with my phone. So it's a pain in the arse.
But the fact that technology even exists, I think is crazy. Because that's the thing. It's one of those things I think, like we talked about before, like you said, it's about 15,000 people or so in Ireland that are currently living with this. And There's not a whole lot. I think awareness is getting better, particularly as more athletes like yourself speak on it and are competing at a super high level with it. But it's one of those things that, like, it's crazy to see that, this is a thing that people contend with. And, oh, Jesus Christ, we've actually created all this technology to manage this thing really, really well. So, yeah, it's great to hear that. Like, because I know you mentioned before that when you were having to regulate it yourself, you mentioned on the Odyssey podcast you were on, you would have to, like, if you had made a choice to have like a lazy Sunday, I believe you said is the example, but somebody wanted to have some kind of spontaneous plan to go on this big hike, you couldn't make that choice then. It would be a much more complex than, say, for like myself or somebody else who isn't contending with this, whereas now with the benefit of the pump, it's much, much easier to make decisions on the fly. So I'd imagine even for the quality of life, that's been a huge addition.
Absolutely. And I think it's very easy with diabetes to get sucked into the data.
Yeah.
I have 24-hour data on my blood glucose, the insulin that's been given, the amount of carbs I've eaten, everything. And you can get very sucked into that. And you forget about quality of life. Is that at the end of the day, I'm not just a person with diabetes. I'm Absolutely, an athlete. Yeah. I have a career. I have a relationship, and I have to be more than just this person with a health condition. And being able to say that my quality of life has improved immeasurably in the last 6 years I can't even explain the value of that. To go from, like, I was very, very scared when I was diagnosed. Like, even though my mum has it, like, it's terrifying. The first moment you're looking at, like, an insulin needle, they are tiny. They're 5 millimeters long. But you're like, I have to stab that into my stomach. And, like, I remember standing in my kitchen and my hand shaking, like, going, just stab yourself. And to go from that, where, like, I remember checking my glucose like 12, 13, 14 times a day, and, like, just being terrified what I'd say, because, like, I was trying to figure it out. And to now to have the quality of life that my insulin pump gives me and to not be worried about my diabetes is incredible. It allows me to be every part of myself without diabetes being a thing that I have to think about. So you said a couple of things there that, like, really, really stick out to me. So one is that you're so much more than just this person that contends with diabetes. This used to be a thing when I was in pro wrestling, right? There would be the lads that would develop an injury that would be ongoing for a long time, and they kind of started to wear it like a badge of honor. They became their bad back or their bad knees or their, broken jaw or whatever. And it became this thing. It became a huge encompassing part of just their identity, and they forgot that they were also a pro wrestler, like, and quite a good one. So I think it's that, like, you mentioned all these other hats you wear, but one of the biggest ones, and I think it can't be overstated, is that, like, you're also one of the best powerlifters in the country, and that can't be overstated because you're only home from IPF Worlds in Malta, and you're one of only 4 Irish lifters selected. Now, naturally, this is your most recent experience, and there's lots of ground I'd like to cover from when you started lifting to now, but that is one experience I want to hear a lot about, because even when you saw the selection process, so it was yourself, Emma McDermott, Alison O'Reilly and Cian Madden. So when were you made aware that you're one of only 4 lifters selected in that process? So I got my invitation a few weeks after Nationals this year. I wasn't aware initially of just how small the team were. I was obviously quite aware of the standards and maybe who had hit or was very close to the standards, but I didn't realize now obviously other people were invited and couldn't go. But when I kind of realized just how few people were selected or were even considered for selection, like, it made me realize how good a powerlifter I was. It was kind of like just this recognition in my own head that how far I've come as an athlete. And it kind of really, because I very much for the last year have focused my identity on being as good a powerlifter as I can be. So I kind of really dove into that athlete identity. And, like, going to Worlds is such an achievement. I think it's every powerlifter's dream is to represent their country at the highest level. And to see you get that invitation in your email is, like, I literally screamed. I was in my office, looked at my phone, saw the email and just screamed. It's such a thrill to get that invitation. It's
huge. Like, not only, like, so IPF Worlds, I'm sure most people listening know, is essentially like the biggest competition you can do in the IPF, in tested powerlifting, essentially. And as we mentioned, yeah, of course, the there was a bit of controversy earlier in the year because they released these new standards for the A standard and the B standard, and there was a little bit of pushback on it. But like that, there was a couple of lifters that really pushed and rose to the occasion. And naturally, the 4 names I mentioned, and yourself included, are some of the ones that really, really pushed for it. So you're one of only 4 that actually ended up going to Malta with the Irish singlet to represent the country. How was the competition? Now, I've heard incredibly positive things about the environment, the place it was held, and a few of the pictures and videos that went up. Big FOMO when I saw how nice the weather was and all that. So hopefully you got a couple of days out there as well. But how was the competition for you?
It was amazing. Even on the practical side of things, the venue was incredible. So it was in the Intercontinental Hotel in Malta. So it was in this huge arena that they have. Warm-up room had 8 Eleiko racks in it.
Wow.
Platform, everything just immaculate. There was a tiered seating area for the spectators, and there was music blasting at them. So like when you're sitting in the audience, you're like really like engaged in a really kind of like hyped up environment. But then as an athlete, you're walking out. So they have obviously their holding area where you're waiting with the TC. And you're coming down this tunnel to the TC, and you can see out into the crowd.
Brilliant.
And it's such an incredible experience. And it was very nice, especially at an international. Sometimes it can be quite dead atmospheres. But the atmosphere at this was just incredible. Everyone was there to like watch the best athletes in the world perform to a high standard. Incredible. Even we had a training venue as well in the hotel, and 3 Eleiko racks in there, brand new plates, brand new bars.
Outstanding, yeah.
And like even like you go and you meet athletes and coaches that you've been following and chatting to for years, and that part is just so much fun. Like it's really networking with people who are and getting to know people who are operating it the same way you do, that are pursuing their goal to be the best powerlifter that they can be in their country and in the world.
Yeah.
And then even looking at the likes of Noemi Alaber and Evie Corrigan, just battling it out. So like I was in the first flight of the session. So I did my deadlifts, was chatting to some of the girls, and then I was like, the 3rd round of attempts is starting on the deadlifts in the 2nd session. I just booted it out to watch, the strongest women in the 52 kilo category absolutely kill it.
Yeah, and that I think that's one of the biggest things. It's actually something I think is quite commonly known in the sport. Most of the people that go and watch powerlifting that are invested in powerlifting are other powerlifters, and you'll always see that. We talked about it briefly earlier on about the 105 flight from nationals, and now as for yourself, obviously it hits home being an under 52 kilo lifter, getting to watch these world class ladies go against each other. So you basically had like the best seats in the house for some of the biggest lifting in the world. Yeah, serious FOMO for missing it. But I got to see some of the stream. I got to see yourself lifting some of the stream as well. And I know, like I said to you before, I liked your really funny little TikTok you made of your bench. Do you know what, actually, incidentally, and we were chatting about the bench, just as an aside, that was one thing I meant to say to you. I find bench is the one that feels the most different on competition day, just as an aside. I don't know what it is. I always feel like when I lay down on the bench, it feels like nothing like it did in training, but as an aside. But yeah, so you went over with the Irish crew. You were there with the Irish team. You got to hopefully experience a bit of Malta. And I suppose that's one thing, as yourself, being an international athlete, only you can really speak on. How was, like, your coach is Jack Thornton?
Yep.
And was Jack across which he was refereeing, I believe?
Jack was refereeing, and he's also there as the Irish team coach. So he handled me on Sunday.
So that must have been really nice.
Oh, it's fantastic. Jack has handled me at 3 international meets.
Yeah.
And he's obviously handled me for 2 nationals as well. So, we have a really productive working relationship together. And I think how much I've progressed since I joined State Gym can only kind of speak to just what a great coach he is.
Yeah, we're very lucky in that way. Between all the different clubs, for such a small country, we've some world-class lifters and really some world-class coaches. And I've been loving to see, as I was chatting to Adam last time when I had him on, I love now that people are collaborating much more. You see way more collaboration between the clubs, the lifters, everyone. There's a much better sense of unity, I think, say, pre-COVID to now, which is brilliant to see, because I think it's for the benefit of everybody on the scene. But yeah, Jack's one of the best in the country. My actual question was going to be, were you handled by a different coach, and what was the experience? But obviously you got to have your own coach there, which is a really, really nice experience. And it must have been, as I said, like a very surreal to be in, you know, such a small, compact little unit to go in from Ireland, but to still show out and have a really good meet. Everyone seemed to have I don't think everyone had their necessarily. I know Ali had a great performance, but I think a few people would say it may not have been my best performance as a powerlifter, but I had an excellent time, and it speaks to. Like I always speak to the importance of the spectator experience, but I really believe we need to do a lot to make the athlete experience. And when you were talking about walking down through the tunnel to the TC and seeing the crowd, I'm sure that's like a memory now you'll have forever, like core memory unlocked, you know? You'll always remember what it was like to walk through that tunnel in Malta.
Absolutely. And just even like in terms of the Irish team, we sent a really small team. But because we sent a really small team, we were able to send the best athletes we could.
Yes.
So you look at Ali, like Ali did incredible. Silver medal on bench. Like unbelievable. Keen and Emma, I believe both PB'd their totals.
Yeah, Emma did anyway.
Emma did. I don't know Keen PB is total. But like there's so many variables that go into traveling for an international competition, all of that. So to have athletes go out and say that it was an incredible competition for them it's such a reflection of the standard of athletes that we're sending.
Yeah. 100%. And I think that it's like, if somebody can say they had it, like it speaks for, like, as I said, for the athlete experience, that it doesn't just always have to be, did they lift the most weight ever on the bar? Or did they just were they treated excellently? Was their experience excellent? And is it something that's going to keep them in the sport longer? I'd imagine like being at Malta and seeing the standard is probably, I know you mentioned a little bit on the Odyssey podcast, like you've probably now be like, I need to work double hard to get even further and I'm going to climb the ranks even more. Would I be right in saying that?
Absolutely.
So how much downtime are you going to have now to build? Like when's your next meet? I think you said you're doing one in December, am I right?
I'm hoping to do, if they send a team to Euros,
yes,
I'm hoping to be selected on that. If not, I'll probably do the Christmas Clash.
Oh, savage stuff. And then after that, probably building all the way to the next Nationals, which has been pushed out a little,
out to November next year, I believe.
I think so.
Yeah, so at the moment, I'm kind of in the middle of a debate with myself as to, am I in a position where I need to move up a weight class now? Mm-hmm. Because I have very much filled out my 52 kilo frame.
Yeah.
My walk around weight has increased kind of to 53 to 54 kilos now. Whereas 2-3 years ago, I was walking around to 51 kilos.
Yeah.
And like obviously the cut does get harder when your walk around weight just starts getting heavier. Mm-hmm. Like, and it's not that my walk around weight has gotten higher and I have lost leanness. Mm-hmm. It's like I'm 54 kilos and I have visible obliques in the morning.
Yeah, you're getting too jacked.
I'm getting too damn jacked. My shoulders are getting bigger. My quads are getting bigger.
Goddamn Jack Thornton and his programming. Goddamn him making you more jacked. That's like straight up. That's a thing for a lot of lifters, especially the longer you're in the sport. It's one of these things that like people talk about all the time. Oh, powerlifting is not efficient for building muscle. Fucking bullshit. Like, look at the people that are in it like 5+ years. They're all fucking brick shit houses. Yeah. Like I was talking to Adam about Andrew Rowe. If you look at Andrew Rowe when he started powerlifting and you look at him now, he's an absolute tank of a young lad. Like, and it's the same with like I train one girl, Shauna Rahman, and she started powerlifting maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and now she's a little bit lighter, leaner, but like jacked to bits. She has this fucking huge back. Like, so that's her complaint. Like, Ian, I don't fit in any of my summer clothes anymore. But it's this thing of like, I really think, I've mentioned on previous podcasts, the powerlifting is a long game. Like if we look all the way back at that, this is obviously like the where your journey currently is, having represented the country at the highest level. But if we dial it all the way back and look at where you started, I know you mentioned on the Odyssey Strength podcast, you started in basically a barbells basic class, like where you were just going through squat, bench, deadlift, and that's what started you down this journey of, oh, maybe I'll start doing a bit of powerlifting training. Oh, maybe I'll try a meet, and then it kind of goes from there. But I suppose that's been a 6-year journey when we look over the course of that time. And like, if you look back to the girl that walked into that barbell basics class after, as you mentioned, you had a previous training history, a bit of a layoff, started trying to get back into training, and this is what kind of captured. Did you believe that you would be this level of athlete in this particular sport given enough time, or was it just a matter of showing up every day?
Oh, I would never have even believed it. Like, if you told me that I'd even be able to squat 100 kilos or deadlift 120 kilos, I would have laughed at you. I did not believe in myself as an athlete when I walked into Cork Strength Performance Centre. It took me a very long time to actually even realise what I was capable of. And I had to do maybe a lot of work on myself as a person and as an athlete to kind of realise what I was capable of. I I'd find it hilarious.
Okay.
I'd think you're pulling the piss out of me.
Was there a tipping point? Was there somewhere in there, was it a competition or a conversation or a period of time where you had that, like, your mentality started to change to say, I am an athlete. I'm not just, I just come in and I do my bit of lifting. No, like I'm an athlete and I start treating myself like one. Was there a point that you remember that happening, or was it gradual?
I think it was actually at the Connacht Open in 2019. I had gone, I competed in the IDFPA for a few years and then went over to the Irish PF. And I did a competition as a 63, then as a 57. And then for the laugh one summer, I dropped 52 kilos. I was kind of like, oh, I'll try 52 kilos, see how that is. Mm-hmm. And I went in and I won my weight class. And I put up really decent squat, messed up my bench and pulled a really nice final deadlift. And from that, I qualified for nationals. I was kind of like, oh, actually, I'm not too bad. So then went to nationals 2020, came second. And then COVID happened and, started training at home. And yeah, it was kind of just around then that I kind of was like, no, I really want to work hard at this. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't that I wasn't working hard before that, but I just wasn't committed to it. I was just kind of like, oh, I like this, but I'm not really too sure how strong I am. Mm-hmm. I don't, if I don't get any better than this, I'd be happy enough. Mm-hmm. And then I went to nationals. I kind of was like, I want to win this someday. Mm-hmm. And I have. But like, I was kind of like, even then I was kind of like, I'm not too sure if I can win it or if I'm strong enough to ever win it. And then during lockdown, because like I was basically locked into my house for the better part of a year, I was considered high risk. Mm-hmm. I was able to work from home for most of it. And like gyms were closed and someone lent me some training gear. Mm-hmm. So I was able to train away. And you kind of start digging down deep into your motivations when you're locked in your house.
Yeah. Oh, I remember I was training on like a little balcony and then like in a living room by myself for months and months and months. Yeah. I remember it was tough. It's especially if you're used to training with a crew or a group of people like you would have at City Gym or I have at Abs. It is very tough to then go to training by yourself. Yeah. So that must have been where you probably saw the depths of your dedication. Like you're like, I actually do really want this. Because there's those, I know myself, I've had those moments you're sitting between sets and you're like, fuck's sake. It's very tough when you're by yourself, when you don't have somebody to vibe off or buzz off or, shoot the shit with or somebody to be like, come on, let's go. That is really tough. So I think for a lot of lifters that like, because I know Ireland lost a lot of good lifters because of COVID, with lockdown. Like a lot of people either couldn't train or fed out of love with the sport. But then I think the people that were able to stick it out like yourself, like it was really that like this was the turn. This was like where things can take that. You're like, all right, I can go deep on this shit. I can really push hard on these weights. If I can do this by myself in my back garden, I can do something big when I'm back around the crew, So I'd say it's great to hear like that was kind of like the turning point. But I think that's a thing for a lot of athletes. It's like, I think when people are new, it's almost like a little bit of an out to say like, oh, I'm just doing my own thing. I'm not, I'm not that good. It's like, but what if you could be? Yeah. But what if you could be world class? What if you actually tried? Now, don't get me wrong. You could try your best and still come last. But it's better to say you tried your best than be guessing. Like look at now, you've been doing your best for a period of time and you've won nationals this year. You came number 1 in your weight class. And then you went on, as I mentioned, as one of only 4 lifters to represent the country, which is massive. And I think it's one of those things that I think there's probably, I know Adam mentioned it to you, like, oh, it must be great to be like an inspiration to other, that's like, you're like, oh, fuck's sake, like I'm an inspiration. Did that ever occur to you along the way? Like even if it's other lighter powerlifters or other women or other people with diabetes, did it occur to you at any stage that this could be a means by which people are looking at your Instagram or whatever and being like, I'd love to be doing what Dawn is doing?
People say that to me and I just get awfully embarrassed when they say that to me.
The shade of pink you're going now tells of how embarrassed this makes you, yes.
I very much appreciate when people say that to me. And, I hope I am of an inspiration to people. If people are in a tough place with their diabetes or even their powerlifting training, that, they might go onto Instagram and go, oh, Jesus, don't squat, whatever today. That's cool. That's amazing. So yeah, it's a really nice feeling to hear that. Like even I remember when I was diagnosed with diabetes, I remember texting a friend of mine, Colin, and I was like, oh, I don't know if I can go back to training. I really don't know what's going on. And he found Jessica Bittner's Instagram and he'd sent it on to me. And he was like, there's a woman with type 1 diabetes. at squat, benching and deadlifting, doing amazing at the sport. It's like, there's no reason you can't do that. So in one way, I hope that I can be that same person to someone else that might be on the early parts of their journey, either in powerlifting or managing their diabetes, where they're feeling a little bit lost, looking for a bit of inspiration. Like, I don't really actually go out to do it. I just kind of talk about my day-to-day life as an athlete with diabetes.
I think that's probably the best way to do it, because it's that thing. It's like, I'm not trying to be this thing. Like, you're not trying to necessarily be this person that inspires all these people, like that who may have diabetes and they're like you know, they're having a bit of a bad day. They look at Instagram and say, well, Dawn's out getting after it, I'm going to do it. But just by doing what you're doing, you could potentially be making that difference to that one extra viewer, somebody who liked your story or just happened to see it or started following you. I think that's like one of the best things about social, for all the bad things people say about social media. I think it's great for helping people in those very niche scenarios to not feel so isolated. And I think that can be massive. But I think the trick to it is that like people have asked me multiple times about the podcast, and, you know, why'd you start doing it? And what are you hoping to get out of it? And even like, how do you make money of it? It's like, I'm just doing it. I'm just going to keep show up and keep making episodes. It could get 5 listeners. It could get 5,000 listeners. It doesn't matter. I just like doing the thing. And I imagine it's the same for you. You're powerlifting and like, obviously you've to manage diabetes because you've like no choice. You know, you have to do that. But like, you showing up and being this excellent, dedicated lifter is something that you're doing. And if that, you're just going to keep doing it whether anybody sees or not. Like, if Instagram went down tomorrow and we never had it, you'd still go train. You know what I mean? And I think that's the difference between people who are like trying to like almost like fabricate a personality to people like yourself who are just being authentic and just doing the thing. And I think that's what people really attach themselves to. But on that's one thing you mentioned before we start recording it. So many people may not know that you did Taekwondo for 6 years.
I did, yeah.
Yes. And one thing you said that I thought was really, really good is that you were talking about the importance of learning that capability as a woman, obviously, but also because people, if they've never met you in person, you're an incredibly small person. So I know it's kind of rewinding things back to like the dawn of time, but can you tell me a little bit about that experience? What drew you to combat sports? Because I'm interested in it, but also even just from the mentality standpoint, I really want to know more about that, because anyone can say, oh, I had this experience, but talking about what it meant to you and the capability it gave you, and you were even talking about the importance for like somebody to learn how to throw a punch correctly. Like, I'd really love to know more about this.
Yeah, so there was a local Taekwondo club near the village near my parents, and I was a very small 11-year-old. And my parents got the idea when I was in 6th class of primary school that, oh, we should do a sport, because I wasn't playing any sport. Not into GAA, not into soccer, which were 2 local options. And they were like, oh, a friend of my dad's was running a Taekwondo club. So they dropped us down one evening, myself and my younger sister. And it was just so much fun. Obviously started off as a white belt, learning how to like punch and kick and, you know, do patterns and, you know, kind of do like kind of sparring, not full contact sparring, but kind of point sparring.
Yeah.
And it was just so much fun. In Taekwondo, you obviously have to grade to get your next tag or your next belt.
Yeah. And
that was every 3 months. And it was just such a dopamine hit almost of like, oh, I'm now my yellow tag, or I've now my yellow belt. And yeah, I did that for 6 years. I'm obviously a very small woman. And like, I would have probably not been the sportiest 11-year-old. But because I was in a kind of a Taekwondo class 2 nights a week, I was able to kind of like shift my identity, kind of being like, oh, I'm not fit, I don't like sport, to being like, this is really fun. I can throw a punch. I can hold my own in a sparring match. I can, I don't know, even break an inch of wood with a punch or with a kick. And it was just so much fun. Like, you know, and even my coach, Stephen Dobbs, who obviously was the first coach, my first coach ever in any sport. Like, he didn't really accept any bullshit. He had girls doing full push-ups. There's no thing as doing girls push-ups on your knees. We were doing burpees. We were running around. You know, he really challenged everyone in the class to be their best self. And even like, I look back on it, like in Taekwondo, you have like an underlying philosophy, and there's like core tenets to like that philosophy. And even like, he drilled home that you had to act in a certain way in class. You had to conduct yourself in a certain way that like respected the kind of the club environment and respected the belt that you had earned. And it was just like such an amazing thing to kind of like teach a kid. And then even, let's say, as I got older, when I was 16, 17, 18, like there is an incredible value to a young woman having confidence in her own body and confidence in, now, I do not buy into, if you do a martial art, you'll be able to defend yourself in any situation. I don't buy that at all. But there, there is a confidence that you get from like knowing that you can handle yourself, that you're physically fit, that if you had to, you could throw a punch and not break your thumb. Again, like I've never had to throw a punch at anyone. I've never been in a situation where I've been in any danger. But at the same time, because I'm able to carry myself with, I don't know, in a manner that exudes physical confidence, I hope, like I can only count that as a benefit as a woman.
Absolutely. And I think it's like you mentioned, like some of the core tenets of the club you're in. And it's like that. It's, even if we look at, so the direct benefit obviously is like physical health and fitness, a bit more mental fortitude. You're obviously, if you're showing up and you're doing the push-ups, you're doing the burpees, you're doing the drills, it takes a certain amount of discipline. So you've got all these direct benefits and knowing how to throw. Like I think this is what a lot of people miss about combat sports. It's not about going out and trying to hurt somebody else or being necessarily in a position to hurt people. Like I hit pads with one of my friends once or twice a week. And it's not because I want to hit anybody. I don't. It's more, for me, it's more like a physical form of discipline. Like fighting training like can sometimes be slightly unpleasant, but sometimes we want to put ourselves in this voluntary hardship to make the rest of our lives a little easier. But I think particularly when you're younger, as you mentioned, the confidence you can gain from it, and firstly seeing what you're capable of. Like if you know how to throw a punch, and as you mentioned, break like an inch of wood or kick your way through it, those are excellent skills that you might never need to use or may not need to use against another person. But even knowing you can, who knows what opportunities that you now, because you had this core capability, you learned, I actually can get really good at this thing if I stick with it. Who knows what things you seized in life that you may not have otherwise done had you not done that. So it's like these residual trickle down effects. Like I would always remember, before we sat down to do the podcast, at any time we've talked at any meets in the past, I would always remember because Irish PF was like this big amalgamation of all these different groups. You would be a person that would stick out to you and say, Dawn's really friendly. So obviously it made you more outgoing. It made you interact with people a lot more. Because naturally you're getting thrown into a class. I'd imagine there's quite a few other young people there as well. They're all doing the training. There's probably a big sense of camaraderie. You have to get to people you don't know, get to know people you don't really know. And then like the mutual suffering of doing all the drills together. And then the big one you mentioned about getting your belt or your tag was like, it's that delayed gratification to know I have to put in this 3 months of graft to get the chance at doing this thing or getting this thing or earning this. And then when it happens, as you mentioned, there's that big dopamine hit of like, you earned it. And I think so much of that can like relate to maybe what brought you to powerlifting. Because I know you mentioned that after you'd been through this 6-year block with Taekwondo, and I know you said you did some BMX as well, which is
mountain biking.
Mountain biking, sorry. That's it. I took up a little bit of road biking earlier this year, so I was like, that's savage. So yeah, definitely want to ask just a little bit about that for fun. But I think then, I know you mentioned you had a bit of downtime a couple of years. You weren't really engaging in too much physical activity. You tried a couple of things, but maybe they didn't really click. But then you got into the barbell training. And while barbell training and combat sports are not necessarily the same thing, I think there's a certain amount of shared value there. And we probably see this with the amount of powerlifters that have gone into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu over the past 2 years. But I really think that's interesting, the things you mentioned, because I think you can apply those to so much of what powerlifting can add to your life, particularly, as we mentioned, for a lot of adults who maybe never gravitate towards sport. Do you think if powerlifting was a thing, then you would have gotten into that when you were younger, if it was around?
Probably. And it's something that I actually put down to my parents. We got Sky TV when I was maybe about 8 or 9, and Eurosport was included in our package. So obviously I would have grown up watching GAA, soccer, rugby, and horse racing. Obviously they're the sports that are available on RT1 Network 2. Yeah. And then Eurosport came along, and all of a sudden we were exposed to this crazy world of other sports that don't really take place in Ireland. So I would have seen Olympic weightlifting, even mountain biking, BMX, climbing, even winter sports like alpine skiing. And you just realize there's such limitless possibilities out there for a sport that might be right for you. And again, especially when you are a very small girl at the age of maybe 9, 10, it's like I was the reason I didn't play GAA is because I was so much smaller than people in my class. So like, it's not very appetizing or enticing for me to go out onto a soccer pitch and to be just knocked around.
Yeah.
Like even now, I played tag rugby for 2 years when I lived in Cork City. And like I got a concussion playing tag rugby because, like someone who was much taller than me literally didn't see me when they turned around and shouldered me in the face.
I know it's not funny, but
It is.
the mental image. Just someone just barreling over you like, fucking hell.
Yes. Yeah, I was pretty unwell for a week after that.
Wow, fucking yeah, like concussions are no joke. They're serious business. But yeah, like like that's what I mean. It's like in Ireland, I think we're like, particularly rural Ireland, I think there's like, we're afflicted with this idea that if it's not a sport on a field, it's not a sport.
Yeah.
Do you know? And you mentioned you got Eurosport and like opened your mind to all these other possibilities. And I really wish more people were exposed to that younger, because I don't think it really matters what the sport is as such. And I don't think it really matters whether you're world class at it or you're just like doing it. I think it adds so much residual benefit, even socially, to have things to go and do. Because I think now, like Raquel and I've talked multiple times about it, there's so many like, it's hard for some like people when they leave primary school and in secondary school and into college and their first work to make friends in their adult life. Like it's one thing I feel so blessed that I've never had a problem with, because I've always been in something. There's always been people around and I like talking to people. You're probably learning now because I don't fucking stop. But I can really, part of me like feel like I can feel for that, like the idea of like that little bit of isolation, because people don't know what to do. They don't know how to approach people. They don't know what shared interest they have. But, and I love that about powerlifting, that anyone can do it at any stage of whether they're like, 17 or 47, it doesn't matter. Like one of the ladies I coach, Mary Fusco, she was at Masters Nationals. Mary only took up powerlifting like 2 years ago and she's in her 60s, and she's a little weapon. She's deadly. Like, but I love that about it. And I really wish there was more. I'd love for Ireland to adopt more of that. Like we talked about powerlifting being this untapped. I think it's so untapped all around the world, but particularly here. Like if we could have that, like, in more places, like in more gyms and more people embracing that, I think you'd see way bigger uptake in all forms of sport. And I think you speak to that like, as you had done all these things. You mentioned the taekwondo, the mountain biking, tried a couple of things, then got into the barbell work. So that speaks to how attractive that can be once you actually see what it can do for you. But do tell me a little bit about the mountain biking. That's for me. I don't care about the audience right now. I want to know about this.
So when I went to college, I went to UL.
Yeah.
And there was a mountain biking club there. And I remember wandering around UL Arena on clubs and socks night, kind of going, what looks interesting? So the mountain biking club just caught my attention. And they were really fortunate to have some funding that they were able to provide like new beginners with kind of a loan of a bike.
Yeah.
So went out and I just fucking loved it.
Yeah.
Like it was a bunch of kind of like lads and girls that were just like, I really love this. Like and it genuinely is the most fun in the world. Like, there's an element of suffering to it. Like you're obviously going uphill, cycling up fire hills in single track and you're dying. And then you get over the crest and then you're just bombing down single track. And there's just such a sense of freedom to it.
Yes.
And joy to it. And like, there's such an adrenaline rush to it as well. Like I was really lucky. I got to go away on trips to France, to the French Alps, to go kind of like cross-country mountain biking and downhill mountain biking.
Amazing.
We used to you get a ski lift up to top of a mountain and then it's just like downhill tracks all the way. Just incredible fun. Obviously, I had big crashes and, I spent my 4 years of college covered in bruises and cuts. But it's just incredible fun.
That's living though. That's amazing. Like and it's one of the great things because I think you have to kind of embrace that little bit. Like I'm sure when you were doing the taekwondo, you probably took a few lumps, even just going home knackered, the legs being sore, the arms being sore from all the drills and the exercise you were doing. But it's like naturally some crashes and biking can get a little ugly, but like, I think you would take all the lumps again for the experiences because it's like even as you're talking about it, I watch like videos of this shit on YouTube now and I'm like, oh, this is amazing. I'm so tempted to try a bit of it, but I don't want to like fuck myself up for powerlifting. Like, would you ever think you'd try it again if you're on a little bit of a break, like an off season?
I was actually thinking about 2 years ago of going back to mountain biking.
Yeah.
And I was going out to a bike shop. I went into Stadium and I did my training session and I was going to go out to a bike shop in Limerick because I was like, oh, I may as well get a bike. I'm living by the Ballygorra Mountains. It'd be cool to get back on a bike. And Jack Thornton approached me. He was like, so World selections are happening. What would you think about going to Worlds?
Right.
And it's like, I don't think I could balance out mountain biking with powerlifting at the current level I'm powerlifting at.
For sure, yeah.
But I'm going to say, never say never.
Yeah.
Like, you could see me back on a bike, back on trails at some stage.
Brilliant.
Maybe not immediately.
Yeah.
But I think it'd be a very hard balance to strike between powerlifting and mountain biking.
Oh, for sure. I think when you're new to powerlifting, or like maybe at like, you know, you're just competing in the odd open here and there. Like, I know Connor did a big cut to do some like road race and stuff, like running. I'd see no issue with that because, again, he was on a bit of an off season for powerlifting anyway. But like, you are like one of the top lifters in the country. So it is that like you could be called upon to represent the country in all these different meets, and you don't necessarily want to do it and to take away from that. So it's one thing I say to a lot of my newer lifters, you don't have to hyper specialize on this right now. We can still do a lot of other fun things. But I think when you're kind of getting closer and closer to that like top level, you probably do need to specialize a little bit more, even if it's just for like a couple of years where you kind of have to be more selective with the activities you engage in. But yeah, like I'm feel you on that though. Like, I'm so tempted. I know now they do, like, I was in Lisbon recently and they have like e-bikes everywhere. The little motor, that makes it so easy. And I've watched videos of lads on like e-mountain bikes and they're like rallying up the hills and going across these big jumps. And I'm like, I would fucking write myself off, but I'm so tempted to try it. Like,
I would die, but I'd be delighted.
yeah, it'd be great fun.
And
like,
even it strikes me now, it's like, you know, like, obviously I was a college student, so like you'd be kind of going out for a few drinks and getting on the bike the next day and you'd be just like dying up the hill. And you're just like, oh, an e-bike would just take that away.
Oh, 100%. It was farcical. Like, we were going up hills and all, and I was like, this is the easiest ride of my life. Like, I can't believe I came home and got on my road bike and I felt like a ton of lead on it. Like, I was like, did I get like 10 kilos fatter when I was away? My legs are burning here. But it was just, I'd gotten used to being on even that, like, you can just rent bikes everywhere. It was amazing. I don't know if you've ever been to Lisbon. Savage spot. But carrying on from there then, in all this time when you were doing all these things, I know you mentioned you got your diagnosis of the diabetes in 2017. Is this something, because again, this is something I don't know and I'd love to know more about. Is this something that can just come on later in life? I know you mentioned there's a little bit of family history there with your mom. I don't know if it's hereditary or not, but like, when did the signs start to show themselves that this is a thing you could get checked for? And like, what were the like red flags for you to say, I need to get this looked into? And did you know during all these times you're in this sport at all, was there anything that like gave an indication that this could be a thing?
So type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune health condition.
Yeah.
So it can happen at any time. It most commonly happens in children, teenagers, and very young adults. But it can happen at any age to anyone. It's like any other autoimmune health condition, like MS, rheumatoid arthritis, kind of thyroid issues. It can just happen. There is a genetic link to it. It's not a very strong link, but you know, if you have a parent with type 1 diabetes, there is a chance that your child can get type 1 diabetes. But there's plenty of people out there who get type 1 diabetes that have no family link. So when I was 27, I was actually prepping for a bench competition in Arklow. And I just wasn't feeling right. I'd done a single lifts competition a few months beforehand, and I just hadn't felt right since then. And like, I remember going to the gym and I failed a 70 kilo squat. Now, I was probably maybe squatting 80 kilos at the time, but it wouldn't be like me to fail a 70 kilo squat even then.
It was something you would have been comfortable enough with.
Yeah. And I was like, oh Christ, I feel like crap. So I went home and I took a day's rest. I went into work and I was kind of like, oh, I don't really feel great. And one of the guys I worked with looked at me, he was like, you look like shit. And he was a very, very straightforward man. He was like, you look like shit. I was like, yeah, I really do feel like shit. And then I had to kind of think, and I was like, well, I've lost an awful lot of weight, because I remember weighing myself on the scales the previous Sunday, and I was like, maybe I competed at 55.5 kilos. That was the weight class in the IDFPA. And I was like 52 kilos. And I did not look well. Like, my skin had was starting to go grey. It was like all colour had drained out of me. And I was really, really thirsty. It was like, you know, when you're really hungover and you kind of like just want to drink lots of water. It was like that all the time. It was a thirst I could not quench.
Right.
It was like my mouth was on fire. And obviously peeing all the time as well, because I was drinking like 7-8 litres of like water and 7-Up Free and Coke Zero a day.
Yeah.
So I felt like shit. And then I was kind of like, had the cop to kind of go, okay, this kind of sounds like type 1 diabetes, because my mum developed type 1 diabetes in her 40s. I would have been probably my very early teenage years, so I kind of would have seen symptoms. So I was like, and I checked my blood sugar and I was like, oh, that's really high. So obviously called my GP. They sent me to a diabetes clinic. Thankfully, it wasn't, because I kind of caught it fairly early. It wasn't an emergency. It didn't have to be an inpatient. They just brought me in, kind of explained this insulin, this, you need to count your carbs. Here's how you give yourself an injection. And I kind of just toddled off home. And yeah, then that brought me to standing in my kitchen, scared shitless to inject myself with insulin.
Yeah, people do sometimes talk about that with the injections. I know, like, even some of the lads I've had on that even talk about using performance-enhancing drugs. They say they talk about the first time they inject, it's just like massive mental barrier to self-inject. Like, you just can't physically bring yourself to do it. But like, even when you got the diagnosis, going into it, did you have an idea that this could be a thing? Or you're like, I think I might have type 1 diabetes?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And you know, like, the symptoms are pretty clear. Like, you know, and maybe because my mum has it, that I was more aware of it. But like, thin, tired, thirsty toilet are the 4 symptoms that you're kind of told of with type 1 diabetes. And I had every single one of them. Like,
Right.
you know, it kind of didn't really strike me that there was any other option that this was.
Yeah. It's even so, like, what I know you mentioned, like, you were kind of just told, and we had this like, well, here's the thing you need to manage for the rest of your life. I can't imagine it was the most pleasant conversation to have with a medical professional.
No.
How were they? Were they like communicating well? Like, did you feel like you were given enough information about it? Like, because I'm always quite interested in how people get on with like the bedside manner of people in the medical field, because I think sometimes they're too used to speaking very clinically and they forget that it's a person on the other end. So I'm always interested for individual experiences.
So like, my doctor, my endocrinologist, and my diabetes nurse, all very kind of calm and clinical, and very much put a message out there of like, this will be fine, we'll figure it out.
Okay.
They kind of drip feed information to you because it's such a huge kind of diagnosis, and it's a really life-changing diagnosis, and it affects everything.
Mm-hmm.
So like, they send you home and they give you kind of set doses of insulin, and they kind of tell you, oh, eat what you normally eat, but you're in contact with the diabetes clinic like twice a week for about 8 weeks after diagnosis. So they kind of give you more and more information as they get to know you. Probably because I grew up watching type 1 diabetes be managed, I kind of went in very gung-ho.
Okay.
That the type of person I am is I'm a very driven and stubborn person.
No.
Unsurprising. And I'm also a very analytical person.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of went into this that, okay, this is a science experiment with one subject. I'm going to learn everything I need to learn about type 1 diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I probably really annoyed my medical team by being that way, because they're probably a bit more used to like, oh, I'm terrified, I don't know what to do, please help me. Whereas I was like, I would like my carb counting course. I would like to learn how to adjust insulin dosing based off my carbs.
Mm-hmm.
What, you know, like, okay, I'm noticing this pattern when this thing happens. What does that mean? And like, really kind of like asking for information, wanting to understand. And like, eventually with diabetes management, you start going into clinic twice a year. So it does very much land in your lap that you have to manage this, you have to learn it. Mm-hmm. And I've now gotten to the stage where I walk into diabetes clinic and I'm like, oh, I'm trying out this thing based off this paper that I read last year about, you know, like in the last couple of years around how fat and protein affect insulin dosing needs.
Yeah.
And like, the dietitian and the diabetes nurse were kind of looking at me going, oh, tell us more.
Yeah, brilliant.
We want to know more about this.
So you're on the cutting edge here.
Yeah. And like, but because I've sat down and I've learned how diabetes, type 1 diabetes works, how the insulin I use works, how, you know, even like stuff around nutrition, I can reliably kind of like run experiments on myself and do it in a kind of a manner that kind of is a bit more robust than some people just going, feck it, I'll do this.
Yeah.
So like, I kind of approached it as a science experiment, and the diabetes team that I deal with kind of rose to meet me there.
I love that you made yourself your own guinea pig.
Pretty much.
So, but I'm very interested to hear that, because my assumption, right, and you know, they say assume makes an ass of you and me, but my assumption would have been a diagnosis like that would have momentarily been, my whole world's falling apart. But it seems like you came at it very logical. It's like, okay, I want to have as much information here as I can so I can like slot this into the life I want to live, and I need to know as much as I can from you, and then I'm going to be educated, get a bit of experience and self-manage from there, and then I'm going to start seeing what works for me, which I think is probably like the most proactive way you can deal with anything. So massive well done on that, because I think if anyone, not anyone else obviously in the world, but I think most people, if they were told there's something now they're going to have to contend with for the rest of their life, they'd probably like have a bit of a fucking meltdown for about a week or two, you know, before they finally come around to say, all right, okay, what do I have to do? And then just kind of follow what they do. But I love to hear that you were like, oh no, I'm going to fucking take this 10 steps further. Tell me absolutely everything. So the couple of weeks post that, you're saying you had to check in with them very regularly. And then naturally you got to a point where you were self-managing. But those first couple of weeks, what was it like learning to manage it? Like, did you have those that, because I know you talked a little bit on the Odyssey podcast, you had a day where it felt like your blood was on fire. I want to know a bit more about that. But I want to know more about like, how was it like implementing it? Was it like a bit of trial and error to try and figure things out? Or what way did you go about, other than standing in the kitchen being like, how the fuck do I jab myself? Like how did it all play out over those couple of weeks?
Oh, it was such a trial and error. Like obviously I was already kind of tracking food intake, because powerlifters, we love to,
yes,
you know, quantify everything. So I was already tracking food intake. So I already had that data. And then I was tracking all the doses of insulin I gave, and kind of then trying to figure out, okay, what effect does 2 units of insulin have on my blood sugar when I eat 55 grams of carbs? And it was like my house was just this wild experiment for 6 weeks. Like I was probably having a nervous breakdown every like 2 weeks as well, going, I don't know if I can do this.
Yeah.
But, you know, I kind of just got on with it.
Yeah.
It was tricky. Like, I'm not going to lie. It wasn't so much that I went gung-ho into it, because that's just the type of person I am.
Mm-hmm.
But there was like often moments where it's like, I actually don't know if I can manage this or how I'm going to like really figure this out going forward. But because I'm kind of like a very techie person anyway, I was diagnosed around the time that continuous glucose monitors were becoming readily available on the market. So I really pushed my team to kind of like get me the funding for a continuous glucose monitor in the first 2 years I had it. So it was kind of a lot of that. I kind of had to like really advocate for myself in a lot of circumstances, where it was kind of like, you know, there's maybe a bit of an attitude of, sure, you're doing fine on the treatment you currently have. Why would you want to have a sensor on you, or why would you want to pump? And like, and it's probably the upside of being diagnosed with a chronic health condition in your late 20s. You know who you are at that point. You know how to advocate for yourself. So I kind of had to turn into my own science experiment, my own data analyst, my own advocate. And, you know, I do think it's definitely made me a better person. And it sounds kind of crazy that like I'm grateful to have a chronic illness, but it's made me use a lot of the personality traits I have in a way that can only benefit myself, and actually make me, you know, maybe a far more sympathetic person to other people, and be able to support other people better.
I think what you said there, it's when you were saying for advocating for yourself, I think that's a thing I wish more people would learn to do, is argue on their own behalf. Like, you need to advocate for yourself first and foremost, because you can't expect everybody else to do it for you. So I'm delighted to hear that you did that, because there is so much of that. People don't want to challenge the status quo, or like, you know, shake the boat, rock the boat, whatever they want to say. But like, you have to be the first person to argue your own position. And it's obviously paid off huge for you. And even that, when you say you're grateful to have the chronic illness, it's this idea that, because I think what people do is they look at their circumstances and they go, they might be doing really well, but like, but what if I didn't have this challenging thing? It's like, would I be even further? It's like, well, who's to say you'd even be as far as you are? Maybe the fact that you are so regimented with your carbohydrate intake, with your insulin, and like you said, you went through this period of trial and error, you'll experiment on yourself. I'd imagine you carry that same amount of regimented, like, analytic viewpoint into your training, where I'd imagine your conversations with Jack and things like that around your training are probably very, like, you'll probably look at the data a lot together and then manage things and how things are going to play out and all that. That's like a dream athlete there. You talked about like when you were going through Taekwondo, that's what probably made you coachable, is somebody who's willing to follow that regime. And I'd imagine that has played off huge. So it's, as bizarre as it sounds, you're probably like one of the best people to actually end up with type 1 diabetes if you're going to approach things this way. If you're techie or analytical, you like data, this is probably something that can play hugely to your advantage. Now, another question I had, because we've talked a few times about tracking food is essentially a must for most people with type 1 diabetes, I assume. I think you spoke about that briefly on the Odyssey podcast. I won't lie, just shout out to the boys, because a lot of my research before we did this was listening to your podcast with them. So shout out to them. They're a good pair of fellas. Had both of them on here at different stages, and I'm looking forward to having them both back on again. But just shout out to them. That's my go-to podcast to listen to, is their one. But you were talking a bit about tracking food. Would you have tracked food prior to ever being diagnosed? Would that have been something you'd done, being fitness-minded and training-minded?
Yeah. So in 2016, I actually lost about 8 kilos of body weight using MyFitnessPal.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, like, obviously, we touched on before that I kind of fell out of love with sport and kind of physical fitness in my kind of early 20s. And kind of, I put up the weight very quickly. I was working in a call center in an absolutely shitty job. And we all used to go out at 3 p.m. and buy shit food to, comfort eat. And then I was like, no, I have to cop myself on here. And I started tracking food on MyFitnessPal.
Mm-hmm.
Probably didn't do a very good job. Had no idea about like macronutrients, but I just kind of like, okay, if I, figure out what my calorie intake is and just kind of like lower it a little bit, I'll lose weight. So I lost 8 kilos that way.
Yeah.
And then went into powerlifting and then kind of started learning a bit more about macronutrients, about the role of protein and, carbohydrates and fat, and kind of like started using kind of like MyFitnessPal to kind of like maybe make sure I was getting enough protein and, sufficient fats and, enough carbs to fuel training. So yeah, I would have used it beforehand, but probably in not such a regimented way. Like I would kind of track for a week and then take a month off.
Yeah.
But kind of like more using it in the way that I think a lot of nutritionists talk about using MyFitnessPal, which is that you use it to learn.
Yeah.
And then you go away and you implement the habits. But I don't have that option any longer. So I've had to figure out how to have a healthy relationship with MyFitnessPal because I'm going to be using it or some version of it for the rest of my life. And like obviously powerlifting, I very much have to control my calorie intake because I walk around at 54 kilos and compete at 52 kilos.
Yeah.
So I have to very much control my food intake anyway. But now in my off season, what I'm working on is how do I have that relationship with MyFitnessPal? Because, like I'm into an off season, I don't need to worry about being 53.5 kilos or 54 kilos to drop down to 52 kilos in like 8 weeks time. So how do I have that relationship with MyFitnessPal without driving myself crackers?
Mm-hmm.
So like, obviously I still track every day, but what I've done is I've gone in and turned my nutrition targets all the way up.
Mm-hmm.
So like, I'm not working towards any target. I'm just, here's my food, here's my information. I'm going to base my insulin dosing off this information. I'm not there going, oh, I want to hit 95 grams of protein and 65 grams of fat and 200 and something grams of carbs. I'm not thinking that way about it. And the other thing I've done is I've stepped away from the scales for a few weeks. So I'm not stepping on my weighing scales every morning. So I'm trying not to think about food and tracking it in terms of body weight and body composition.
Mm-hmm. That's actually probably a really good way to do it because like obviously tracking's integral to your long-term health and, like not dying. I think it's probably a great way to use the tool because that's kind of one of the tricky things. And it's particularly I've worked with so many people in the general public and tracking calories can be this challenging thing for people either to physically do it or like what type of relationship it creates for them in food. And same with the scales. It's actually one thing I don't like. A lot of trainers call it the sad step. I think that's kind of a shit way to put it. It's a tool. And for some people, maybe they don't need to use it. But I like that you've realized that it obviously does play a role in our sport, but also in managing the diabetes. But you're in a part of your life now where it probably is worth just kind of seeing, do you need to be as regimented? And is this something you can try out for a little while? And I suppose you've probably gotten way more educated over the past 6 years with food. I know you were working with Katrina Connolly, is that right?
Yeah.
And have you ever worked with any other nutrition coaches or anything like that?
I worked with Anna Hurahan for a while when she worked with Sigma Nutrition. So both fabulous, obviously Anna's a dietitian, Katrina's a nutritionist, both fabulous people to work with.
Yeah. I think that's like a massive piece of the puzzle for so many people. And I think it's kind of different to like having a coach because a coach is like, you're always going to be training. So it's nice to have your coach there to always refer back to. But like I work with Shane Story from My Nutrition when I'm coming into meets that I want to weigh in comfortably under 93 because I'm a bit of a fat fuck. I like to eat my food, but Shane is like my resource. I know I'm a coach. I know how to count my calories. I know what my targets are. But it's nice to be able to externalize that, free up the bandwidth, and say when I need to be on game ball, I want you on my corner. But like when I go into an off season, I usually self-manage. Like I'm prepping for Western Euros now, so I have Shane back on board, and he's going to ensure I don't waddle onto the platform. But I think it is that it's kind of like a bit of a seasonal role, but it's probably great for you to know you've got these excellent people that you could always refer, because I know you train in the same gym as Katrina, so I'm sure if you even ever did have a question, she'd happily help you out. But I'd imagine at this stage of the game, you're probably pretty well educated now on most things nutritionally. Was there any like surprises when you were like discovering more about food, like when it even related to the diabetes or not? Like, was there anything that you're like, oh, I didn't realize this did this, or this had this effect on this? Was there anything that stands out as like a surprise from nutrition? I have a few myself, like, but what were yours if you had any?
Like, I think before I had diabetes, I was very much like, oh, I can't eat sugar because sugar is bad for you.
Right.
So like, I very much came of age in a Kate Moss kind of dominated era. Nothing tastes better than skinny. Then into orthorexia central of the early 2010s. Like when I graduated college, it's like we're into like, don't eat sugar. Sugar is bad for you. Don't eat gluten. Don't drink milk. And you're like, what the fuck can I eat?
Yeah. I remember.
So, and like, I think that kind of really affected my relationship with food as well. So like, you're there kind of going, okay, I like food. Like I'm a foodie. I enjoy, like going out for meals. I enjoy cooking. I enjoy baking. And then like social media is pumping this message at you that all the things you like are bad for you. Mm-hmm. And that's not a good way to be. So, and we kind of start internalizing all these terrible messages. And then when I started powerlifting and obviously started working with Anna at one stage and then Katrina more recently, like, I remember like one of the first things Anna had me working on was eating something kind of carby before training. Mm-hmm. Just eating like 40 grams of carbs before training and it being kind of like a quick acting carb. Mm-hmm. And like that was just a game changer. And now I've turned into one of those powerlifters that walks around the gym with my bag of jellies, my can of Monster, like fulfilling every stereotype. But like once I kind of moved away from that thing of like, no, sugar is bad. You can't eat refined sugar. It was like such a game changer. Yeah, it's I think the more educated you can actually get on nutrition, not just following like Cosmo magazine, it's so liberating to realize, Jesus, most food's fine. It's usually for most people the poisons in the dose with these things. Like even you mentioned the sugar one. I remember a huge amount of that. Like where like everyone was going mad on like low carb and ketosis and all in the like early 2010s. It was like there's all these like trends, or intermittent fasting was a big one for a while. But yeah, I always joke with the lads that they always know when there's a new batch of powerlifters because the stock in Haribo and Rice Krispie bars goes through the roof. And then if for some reason there's one weekend out of the year, like every couple of months where like talc, baby powder sales go way, way up. That's how you know there's a powerlifting meet on. But the big eye-opening one for me was like the role of like fiber in the diet. Like the problem for me is that like I have a very, very good varied diet, but sometimes like it's that if I'm not tracking, fiber is really low, and sometimes if I am tracking, the fiber is a little bit too high, and it plays havoc on my guts. So this is like the explicit portion of the podcast where I tell you about like how my poo cycle is. But it was like that was really, really interesting for me to learn way back when I first started training and tracking and things like that. Is like this thing that is it. Well, now it's talked about more, but when I first ever started training, no one talked about fiber. It was all about your protein intake, your calorie intake. I knew the roles of carbs and fats, but I was like, what the fuck is this one thing for? And that was a big eye opener. When it's one of those things, I think it's nutrition is that like iceberg that like if you really get into it, you can see, like I'm sure you probably felt it as well. I do as well. If you even have that like fast acting carb before training usually goes a whole lot better than if you just hadn't eaten like 4 or 5 hours before. I'd imagine doubly so for you, being that little bit more sensitive to it. Like, but they're really, really eye-opening things. So anyone listening, I would always say to them, if you're in powerlifting, even for a short period of time, and even just 3 months, work with it. Either a dietitian or nutrition coach that is like reputable, like Katrina, like Anna, like Shane, the people at Sigma, even Triage Method, whoever it is. Like there's all these really reputable coaches there, and it'd be worth even in the short term getting on board with them. But that then ties into like when I remember you talked about this because I wanted to ask you this. Do you remember you were talking about on the Odyssey podcast? You had just come home from your honeymoon, so you're happily married. You were 63, or you're weighing in under 63. So you managed to compete under 63, under 57, and now under 52.
Did you feel the most comfortable in the under 52? Did that feel like the right fit? Or would you say now, if given enough time, you'd like to grow into under 57?
Under 52 has always been kind of a very comfortable weight category for me. And under 57 would also be a good fit. Like I don't base my identity on I'm an under 52 lifter.
Yeah.
I went into it literally for the laugh for one competition and did well in it.
It just worked.
And I've continued to progress in it. Like if you look at my total on open powerlifting, my total has gone up and up.
Yeah.
I have never not PB'd my total in a competition. So like as long as that kind of keeps going, I'm pretty happy to be at 52. Even when I went 52, I kind of put a set of rules in my own head as to the 52 kilo experiment will end if X, Y, or Z happens. That was if my total started dropping, if my daily calorie intake dropped below 1,600 on a regular basis. Obviously, the week before comp, it does go down. But like if I was sitting at 52 kilos and my food intake was so low, I was miserable. And to me, 1,500 calories is around that where I'm hangry all the time and I want to kill someone. If I lost my periods.
Yeah.
So for me, menstrual health is a huge sign of overall health for a woman.
Yeah.
So if I lost my periods, I was like, no, that's not happening. Or even, let's say if my cycle length got very long, that I'd be like, no, this is not worth it.
Can I actually ask a question? Is that impacted by the type 1 diabetes at all, if it's mismanaged? That's, again, just something I'm not currently massively aware of. I'd love to know a bit more.
I think it can. If your blood sugars are quite high, it can affect menstrual cycle. Kind of like, as far as I'm aware, it can.
Yeah.
And then your menstrual cycle can affect your diabetes as well because it affects insulin sensitivity.
Yeah, these are the sorts of, like, Jesus, I've had lifters, I've even, like, girl lifters, and they're, like, shocked that I even know what a luteal and a follicular phase is. They're like, how do you know? But there's girls I know that don't know what these things are. Like, I really think there's such a, like, big gap in education around, like, obviously the diabetes, but even that, like, for female hormone cycles, whether they're, like, on their natural cycle or they're using some kind of contraception. Like, there's another podcaster that works here, AOK Nutrition is her name, and she really talks a lot about that stuff. And I think it's this big missing piece for a lot of, like, not women in general, but also I think female athletes. I think that can be a big game changer for understanding more about how you perform and how your body performs. Yeah. Have you found a difference?
I actually think the conversation around menstrual health and powerlifting is not very nuanced at all. So there's a study that came out recently that was like, oh, there's no variance in strength during your menstrual cycle. And
I think I'd seen that, yeah.
And like and it kind of seemed to shut down the entire conversation. Mm-hmm. And I was like, but there's so much more to it than just like, that a broad average of a population doesn't have any variance in strength. Like, let's say, like, obviously individuals are going to differ from each other anyway. Mm-hmm. So you could have one female athlete that doesn't see any difference throughout their cycle. And you could have another athlete whose strength dips massively when she has PMS or when she has her period. Mm-hmm. Even on an individual basis, like, I find weigh-ins during certain times of my menstrual cycle can be very difficult. Yeah. Like, my body weight goes up, increases once I ovulate to the time I get my period, my body weight will increase by about 1 to 1.5 kilos. Mm-hmm. So, like, and I can't choose a competition based on where I am in my menstrual cycle. Yeah. So I basically, if I get a selection for, I don't know, Worlds, I go into my app that tracks my period, and I'm like, okay, I should be ovulation there, or I should be on day 21 or day 25 there. My cut is going to have to be so much harder to counter that rise that once whichever hormones are released or start rising that make my body weight increase. So, like, as a female athlete, I have to be very aware of it. Yeah. But even outside of that, like, like, you could have athletes that could be absolutely fine most cycles, but might have one cycle that they're absolutely flattened or have brutal period pains. Mm-hmm. And because we've just gone, oh no, the conversation is female athletes don't have strength variances during their menstrual cycle, is like, but there's so much more to that. And
100%.
And I think both athletes and coaches need to be aware of it.
I completely agree. I felt when I saw that it was such a tone-deaf paper, because let's just hypothetically say, right, maybe if, let's say there's an element of truth to it. Let's say it's true that your potential for top-level strength is the same throughout. That does not mean a lifter's approach to training is the same throughout. It doesn't mean how they, like, what mindset they get into before they approach any given task, whether squat, bench, or deadlift, just the ones we specialize in. That doesn't mean their approach to that's the same. It doesn't mean it's as comfortable to set up the same way, whether belt the same way. It doesn't mean their environment's experienced the same way. It doesn't mean the amount of, some people like to get nice and aggressive before they lift. Maybe they can't generate that same level of aggression. You know what I mean? I think these are the variances that have a huge impact on performance that they probably don't take into consideration when they talk about these things. There was another one recently I had seen. I can't remember. I need to find it. It was a PubMed one anyway. It was that the contraceptive pill does not necessarily make women gain weight, right? Now, the thing I would challenge about is taking the pill itself may not make you gain weight, but the impact it might have on your hormone profile might make your proclivity to overeat bigger, or your proclivity to under exercise, or like your motivation to get up and move around might be blunted. Do you know? And these are I get that's not necessarily what the papers are setting out to say, but it's the public interpretation of these things can be so poor that you'll take a title at face value without understanding anything about it. Like, so like that, like the performance is not necessarily impacted by where you're at in your cycle. It's people are going to see that completely misinterpreted. And I already know there's probably coaches that have said this to the lifters. You should be just as strong now as you were 2 weeks ago. It's like, oh.
Yeah. But on the flip side, then we also have coaches selling programs based around women's menstrual cycles. Mm-hmm. And that's a complete charlatan, like a charlatan act as well, because you don't necessarily know whether your female athlete is going to have a dip in performance after she ovulates or when she has her period. And telling women then that, when you have PMS, you're going to be weaker. And that's noceboing.
Yes, 100%. It creates a massive negative feedback loop. Yeah.
So if you tell someone you're going to feel tired, you're going to feel terrible, they're going to go into the gym and tell themselves, I feel terrible. I'm not going to perform very well.
That even if they don't believe you, the moment the bar doesn't move the way they were expecting, they immediately have the voice in the back of the head echoing those sentiments you said. And it's almost like a little confirmation bias for them to say, maybe that's right. And it's going to constantly be a thing. And it can be small things. I think I'm a huge advocate for the type of language that we use is way more important in many cases. That, we could have a message and I could say it to you 10 different ways. Say with execution of a movement, let's say a deadlift, right? I could see somebody who deadlifts in a really inefficient way, right? Whatever it might be. It doesn't matter about how inefficient or whatever. And somebody could say, that's shit. You need to work on that, right? And that person's probably going to pick that sentiment up really negatively and be very in their head about how they deadlift. We could take a look at it and frame it a completely different way and say to somebody, this is brilliant. You're able to, pick up a fucking impressive amount of weight. The exciting thing is that we can work over the next couple of months and get this way more efficient, and that's probably going to potentiate much more performance out of what you've already built. So we're telling them the same information, that there's something we need to work on, but it frames it in a way that the person will now approach the movement in a much more optimistic way. And I think movement optimism is something a lot of coaches miss. I think some coaches see their job as being their lifter's biggest critic rather than their biggest supporter. And like that you mentioned with misunderstanding female menstrual cycles, I nearly said mental health. This coach that's releasing these programs, or these coaches, I'd imagine a massive amount of that is probably just sheer ignorance. They probably found out women have a cycle and are like, I can make a program around that. And that's the danger of, I think, social media. People know a little bit about something and they're not willing to ask more or study more. This is why I wanted to talk to you about type 1 diabetes. I know a surface level amount, but you have lived experience. You can teach me way more than anything I can read on the internet. And I think that's why these conversations are important, and being able to ask these things, even asking about female menstrual cycles. I think there's people that aren't willing to have those conversations. I don't know if it's because they're uncomfortable or maybe they think it doesn't make a difference. As a female, I'm sure you probably know yourself, you've probably had differences in training, both positively and negatively based on where you are. And like you mentioned, it can greatly impact even how you cut weight. But I do think it's amazing that you have the availability of technology to track that far ahead, that you can plan that. That's so cool to me. I like stats and things like that as well. So I think that's really, really cool. But I'm really happy that we got a chance to touch off that, because not only, again, I could speak to any female about this, but obviously being IPF World Powerlifter, I think it's great to have your perspective on this. Now, given you're obviously working away with Jack there, I'd imagine he's one of the best coaches in the country. I'd imagine he's really dialed in on these things, at least in your experience. You probably have had these conversations before as well. You don't have to reveal too much. I know, like, you want to probably keep these things a little bit private, but I'd imagine that's one of the reasons you and him have worked together so well over such a long period of time, and why City Gym has become your powerlifting home is for that and the support network around you as well.
Yeah, and like we use RPE a lot in my training.
Yes.
So, and it's actually one of my bugbears is how people use RPE sometimes. So RPE it's your own self-perceived rate of exertion. So like, and that can vary massively from session to session. And people go into training sessions and they go, oh, okay, I'm going to hit a single at 8, and they have the number in their head. But because I use RPE in a particular way, I go, okay, I meant to hit a single at 7 or 8 today, and I work my way through my warm-ups and kind of go, okay, that wasn't the 7 or 8 I meant to hit, I'm going to go up. But because I'm able to use RPE in that way, I'm always able to kind of adjust my training around how I feel that day. And that obviously helps with the diabetes, even helps with like, if I come in after a stressful day at work and I feel like shit. Like, and it's okay if a whatever weight moves at an RPE 8, and 4 weeks ago it would have moved at an RPE 6. It doesn't actually really matter what weight is on the bar. It's the exposure to the work that matters. But because I'm able to use RPE and Jack has most of my work programmed at RPE, I'm just able to adjust around whatever is happening.
Yeah, I'm a big advocate for RP as well. I use that with a lot of my lifters, but I do find that as well. Sometimes they prescribe a number.
Yeah.
And I'll say to them, and I'd actually ask you the same, I'd say to them, if you have to have a number, give yourself a range. At least would you approach that? Would you say like, it will probably be somewhere in here if things are going well, and it might be a bit less if I'm not feeling as good? Or would you just go in and literally just go until it feels like the right RPE?
I used to be kind of the first instance where I was going in kind of going, it should move, like let's say if I had an RPE 8 single and squat, I'd kind of go in, it should move between 112.5 to 120. And I kind of started feeling like I was chasing the number then.
Yeah.
So I've actually kind of like, especially in the last year, kind of pulled it back going, it is meant to be an RPE 8 single. It go in, warm up, load 20, load 70, load 90, load 100, see how they all move. Yeah. Stop trying to project. Yeah,
I 100% agree. Even from first-hand experience, a week and a half before Masters Nationals, I pulled a 290 in training and it felt brilliant. And then we had Masters Nationals. I wasn't very well last week. I wasn't mad sick, but I just wasn't sleeping great. And I had training on Thursday for deadlifts. And I said it the same idea. I'm going to work up to an RP8 single. And for me that week, it just happened to be about 250. And I just left it. And there's that thing, people are like, are you not going to go any heavier? It's like, no, that's enough for me today.
Yeah.
You know? And I think that's one of the things that I really think more people could really, really try nail this message home, that progress is not linear. You don't have to go in every single week and lift heavier or even as heavy as you can. Sometimes, like you said, it is just about showing up and putting the work in, putting the frequency, the volume in, because the intensity can always come later. And sure, it only matters like once or twice a year when you're on a platform, really, you know. And I think, given the level you're lifting at, I think it lends to that you can say that, like, you know, for you, it might be one day to go in and pull something that's probably like 10 kilos below what you might even open with, but it's still getting the work in. And I think it's great to take that little bit of pressure off having to perform for every training session, because I think that's going to start making a massive amount of like mental fatigue on the lifter if they feel like they always have to live up to a certain number.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And it was one of my biggest evolutions as an athlete was moving away from that mindset where I was like, oh, if I don't hit this number on my squat, on my bench, and on my deadlift every week, I'm not making progress. And I used to, and then like obviously life happens. I used to like think I should always hit these numbers at this RPE. And I'd go away from the gym having not hit them and be like, oh, I'm a terrible powerlifter, like really getting down on myself, really beating myself up, like, and having terrible training sessions because my mindset was just awful. Like, you know, like, and if I heard someone like talking like that about their lifting now, I would literally pull them on it.
Yeah.
And like be like, you need to stop talking to yourself like that. That is the best, possibly the worst way to talk to yourself, but it's the quickest way to like drain any enjoyment out of sport. But now, because I'm there going, it's like, no, this is the RP you're meant to hit. The weight doesn't matter. Is that I don't have bad training sessions any longer. Like, it's like, no, I've come in, I've done the work, and I actually use an analogy of saving money in the bank. So every training session, it's a deposit in your bank account. You're not looking to use that money straight away. It's just money away. And when you go into competition, when you step onto that platform, that is when you're withdrawing that money. Training is the same way. You're going in, you're doing your 4 or 5 sessions a week, and you're just building up that little savings account. And whatever you do in the gym, it doesn't really matter. Like obviously the lifts have to be done to a technical standard that will pass in training. You are probably looking to like make some sort of progress block to block.
Yeah.
But in reality, those numbers don't really matter. We all love posting PBs.
Yeah.
We all love like hitting them in the gym. But the only time they actually count is on the platform for me as a powerlifter. So why am I getting het up about, oh, I only squatted 115 in the gym today and it felt really nasty and grindy? It doesn't fucking matter. It's like the only thing that matters is when you step onto that platform, how is that weight going to move?
Yeah. And do you know what? I really think that can't be said enough, particularly to newer lifters. But you mentioned a bit about the self-talk. And I made a note of this when I listened to your podcast with Adam and Connor, because there was a couple of points in it, particularly when you were selected for Western Euros. You were like, oh, am I good enough to do this? I'd imagine nowadays, lifting to the level you're lifting to, has your self-talk changed to be more like that? Like you're not beating yourself up if you're not lifting a certain number. You're realizing that every training session is a deposit in that bank to be withdrawn on the competition platform. Like, did you have a time when that switched for you, or was it that it just gradually, like earlier on, we're talking about the mindset, becoming an athlete was the same thing. Gradually, you start having a bit more of your own back with what you tell yourself about your training.
I worked with a sports psychologist for about 6 months to kind of really work on it.
Brilliant. That's really cool.
Amelia Potter, she is brilliant.
I've had like 3 or 4 people say they really want me to try get her on the podcast. It's something I will try put together. She doesn't live in Ireland, though, am I right in saying?
Yeah, she's based in the UK.
Yeah, so we'll have to try and coordinate it. But yeah, I've only heard glowing praise. Yeah.
Yeah, and anyone who I recommend go to her, when they go to her to come back, she's amazing. So that part really helped. Kind of like I went to her specifically to deal with my kind of fear and anxiety that I get around squats. And kind of we did a bit of work kind of around self-talk and kind of like comparison that I kind of had in my own head to other lifters. And then kind of when I finished up with her, I had moved up to Limerick at that stage with work. So I was training in city gym full time. So kind of like being around like lifters that were, a lot of junior and sub-junior lifters. We have a lot of juniors and sub-juniors in city gym. And it's kind of like when you start hearing like new lifters talking and you hear some of the things you're saying kind of parroted back to you, you're like, oh, that sounds really bad. And then you're like, wait, they're saying it. And I'm like, that's not a good thing for a new lifter to be saying. Why am I saying that? So like one of the things I used to go on with, and Ben called me out in it one day, is like, oh, I'm a one-trick pony because I have a big bench. Like I love bench. Bench is my one true love in powerlifting at least. But I always kind of like I developed this identity that I'm a one-trick pony, big bench, shit squat, all right, deadlift. And Gar called me out in it one day in the most polite manner. And I kind of went away going, maybe Gar's right here.
That's Gar, the most polite man in powerlifting probably, yeah.
Yeah, and about 3 months later, I messaged Gar and I was like, Gar, you said something to me about 3 months ago. And you don't even remember saying it, I bet. But I was like, you really changed my mind on how I approach my squat. And like, I went from kind of like going, oh, one trick pony to being like, no, I'm an athlete. This sport is about a total. It's like my squat may not be the best squat in the 52 kilo category, but it makes up a significant proportion of my total. So maybe if I stop talking to myself and tell myself I'm shit at it, it might get better. That's
huge because that mindset shift will change how you approach, even how you train.
Yeah.
So even recognizing though that was something you needed to work on, going and working with Amelia. It was Amelia. Yeah. I know it's Potts Thinks on the internet. I follow her on I knew you said on the internet for fuck's sake, on Instagram. I even recognizing the benefit of that, I think is huge. I think it's when lifters are willing to like get out of their own way. That's when they get their best. But yeah, the self-talk is huge. I had the same thing, but I had it with bench press. I used to say I hated bench. I didn't, whatever. I used to have a dodgy shoulder from wrestling, so I didn't like how bench felt. And I would say, like, fuck bench is whatever. No one cares about bench. But it was only when I switched and said, you know what, fuck it, bench is deadly. I'm going to have a big, massive fucking chest and a big, massive bench. I put 15 kilos on it in the space of about, I'd say, a year. You know what I mean? Which is, for that lift is massive. You know what I mean? Yeah. So reframing those things, I think, is really good. And that's the thing. It's there's another guy I know, right? He's He's younger than me, right? He's like 28, 29. But it'd be, getting in the chair and he's like, he's like, no, getting on now. Back's starting to go. The knees are starting to go. I'm like, Stephen, shut up, man. But because he tells himself that, he acts like that. He carries himself as if he's, been thrown down the side of a mountain twice in a barrel or something like, and he's gotten the shit knocked out of him. And I think the narrative you tell yourself all the time is going to greatly dictate not only how you perceive yourself and what you do, but a lot of times how you present yourself to other people. Like even bringing it all the way back to your taekwondo, I think having had that environment and growing in that environment and showing yourself your capability, it probably really stood to what you're capable of doing and how you exude it. We say confidence. Confidence is kind of a catch-all term, but capability and understanding a bit more about yourself. And I think the problem for a lot of people is they downplay or undersell what they think their capabilities are. And because of that, they put across this, it's like a self-limiting belief across everything, how far they can go in their job, how much money they can make, what sports they could do, how many friends they could have, what they could engage in. So I love when people just do the thing. They just show up and do the thing. I know you've done it with powerlifting. You've obviously been an IPF referee as well. You've thrown yourself into powerlifting full on. You've traveled many places in the world to do it. So if you had any, let's say 2 or 3 key pieces of advice for younger powerlifters, if you were speaking to the younger crowd in City Gym or whether the Abs Academy or the young guys in Chaos or Odyssey or whoever it might be, what piece of advice would you give them? I know they're kind of putting you on the spot now, by the way. But
outside of getting a coach, that would be obviously my number one piece of advice. But outside of that, first of all, this sport is meant to be fun. We all work jobs, go to college, whatever, have commitments outside of powerlifting. Powerlifting is a very small part of our life and it is meant to be enjoyable. It's meant to reduce our stress. So approach it in such a way that it is fun. And I think people get so hung up on I'm not driven by motivation. I'm super disciplined. I'm like, fuck that bullshit. I'm going in because I fucking love this sport. I love walking into City Gym and hearing someone going for a PR. Talking to my training partners and having to crack with them. That is what the sport is meant to be about. It's fun. Secondly, find your spot on the spectrum of technique, efficiency, wherever that is. Obviously, everyone needs to squat, bench, and deadlift to competition standards. Mm-hmm. I think people bullshit themselves a lot when they're like, oh yeah, I'm squatting high in training. I will definitely make depth in competition. You won't. Red light. But obviously, then people get very, very hung up on everything has to look beautiful and pristine. I have an ugly deadlift. I have an ugly squat. I have a very pretty bench, thankfully. But I don't care. I round my back on my deadlift. And that works for me. It's a very technically efficient movement for me when I round my upper back. I don't care that someone's looking at me going, oh, she's going to snap her spine. I'm not going to. I've never hurt my back sumo deadlifting anyway. You have to find that sweet spot in between being technically correct, so you get a white light from the referee, but not becoming neurotic about technique. Yeah. And the third one is please give back to the sport.
Yes.
This sport supports us all. It has sent me to international competitions. The very least I can do is sit in a ref's chair for 3-4 hours every few months. Unfortunately, because I've been so busy between work and training, I haven't been able to do it as much as I want to. But giving back to the sport is really important. And that can be really simple stuff like grabbing a bin bag at a competition and picking up the rubbish. Geez, even just putting your rubbish in the bin would be a help.
That would be brilliant if people could do that, yeah.
Yeah, helping venues get set up and get taken down. Sitting on a table and taking attempt slips from coaches. Giving back to the sport only helps the sport grow.
I think that's a huge one. I think it's particularly, I've spotted and loaded at quite a few meets over the last while, and it's always the same faces that help. Now, don't get me wrong, every once in a while somebody else jumps in, and I do get for some people with that particular role, they're afraid they're going to fuck up. And I know people can't just jump in the referee chair, they need to sit the exams and things like that. But I think people misunderstand that there's so many tiny jobs that are done behind the scenes that mean massive, the warm-up room manager who makes sure that people are putting weights back, make sure everyone has their armbands, make sure it's the correct amount of people in there so the lifters have the most space. So many, even taking tickets at the door, stamping hands, whatever it might be, even if it's going, like you mentioned, grab a bin bag, throw a few things in the bin, fold up your chair at the end of the meet, whatever it might be. All these tiny little jobs make
it runs so much more smoothly for the place we've held the meet and the people who are organized. And I think that's what they forget, particularly say like nationals. Like, so this is just, we'll wrap up shortly, but a little known story for nationals. The rack we used at nationals that belongs to me. That's my rack. The green rack's mine. The night before nationals, I had to go get 2 power bars from my house because we didn't have enough and we didn't have enough plates. So I got like 2.5s collars and a lot of the chip plates and things like that. They were all mine, right? This was the night before I was going to lift as well. But it's these things have to happen. The lads drove up from Cork and Limerick with squat racks. Jay brought half of abs in to put together the stage. You know what I mean? So all these things that just like when people show up and they just see a cool venue put together, whether that's Chaos Gym, whether it's City Gym, whether like even City Gym looks nothing like it does in the competition day. And then you see people training there like 2 days later, the whole gym looks totally different. So that's obviously a massive, massive job to set that up. And even if you can't be there on the weekend, just to do something small like that, I think is huge. Just to show that you want to lift on the platform, which is obviously brilliant. And I think the best thing about powerlifting is that everybody can do it essentially. You know, like it doesn't matter if you're tall or short or big or small, or if you're a young person or an older person, if you're a man or a woman or whoever, you can powerlift. You know, if you can squat to depth, if you can bench a bar to your chest and back up, and you can pick a bar up off the floor, you can powerlift. So that's brilliant. We want that, but the way we facilitate more of that happening is from the people that give back that you may not even know. You know, so yeah, that's a huge, huge piece of advice. I know you posted a box on Instagram. Did anyone want to talk about it in particularly before we wrap it up?
The biggest question I got was advice for new lifters in the sport.
Excellent.
And around diabetes and powerlifting.
I think we tapped on all of that so far. Dawn, it's been real. Thank you very much for coming on.
You're very welcome.